What is the worst event in human history? In the beginning the universe was created. This had made many people very angry and has been widely regarded as a bad move. Many were increasingly of the opinion that they'd all made a big mistake coming down from the trees in the first place. And some said that even the trees had been a bad move. And that no one should ever have left the oceans. No AC. Getting eaten alive. Breathing in whale sperm. Fuck that. All of that still happens in the UK. Top comment every single time this gets asked. Cambodian genocide under Pol Pot has to be up there. Imagine waking up one day to find your country now wants you dead because you have a high school education. And a bunch of dipshits with machetes are coming for you. I'm too late on this, but did you know that Cambodia had a thriving rock scene in the 60s and 70s? This incredible music scene, centered in Phnom Penh, took inspiration from a range of contemporary sources including traditional Khmer, American funk and soul, and British psychedelia. It's believed that the popularity of these music forms took off as locals were able to access U.S. Army rock radio, broadcast to GIs in neighboring Vietnam during the war in the region. Popular musicians of the era included Pen Ran, Shin Sisamut, and Yol Alarong. Tragically, this burgeoning music scene was not to last. Pol Pot's brutal communist regime took over the country in 1975, and in the following 3 years 25% of the country's population were to perish through mass execution, starvation, and disease. The rock music scene was viewed as anti-agrarian and anti-Khmer. As a result, famous Cambodian rock singers and musicians were targeted by the regime. Ran, Sisamouth, Alarong, and most of their contemporaries disappeared, along with millions of other citizens, never to be identified or recovered. What I find so affecting about this story is that their music, while frozen in time, is still with us. The wonderful tones of Khmer singers, the ever so familiar riffs and licks of Western rock, blended with Southeast Asian lyrics are available to listen to on Spotify. They never grew old, and we never got to see what they would have done next. But we have been gifted this snapshot of history, an alternative future for Cambodia never to be realized. I urge you to give them a listen, and to consider the sheer tragedy that befell these stunning artists performing in their prime. I really like this reimagining of the Beatles' Hard Day's Night by Pen Ran and Corn Panau. Also check out the autobiographical novel First They Killed My Father, for an account of one child's experience during the Khmer Rouge regime. Yes, actually, I had the pleasure of working for stage show concert called Cambodian Rock Band that blends Cambodian rock music with a narrative taking place in Phnom Penh. Then and today. Great show. If you Google it you'll find promotional teasers from various theaters. I don't want to provide a link to give away which one I worked for. Hey, I'm in DC and just saw an ad for this. I will actually consider going now. I've been to Cambodia and never knew about the rock scene. My mum escaped Cambodia during the genocide. From what it remembers she said she had to live in the jungle forest for a long time with her family. One of her brothers died during this time. Luckily they were sponsored by this old couple from my town in Canada and I think there was mention of some refugee camps or something like that. Now she lives in Canada. I once knew a girl who lived there with her family. There was a warning they should leave so they did, their entire town was wiped out. My parents threw a surprise party for me when I graduated high school and invited 2 of my exes. Whoa. After my wife and I got married, we went to a barbecue at a local park. I went for a little walk. I came back to see my wife sitting at a table, in a conversation with 3 of my ex-girlfriends. I panicked, and moved to Venezuela. I may have overreacted. Too close to call. Am I right? You made the right call. They trolled you. My mom kept a pic of the 3 of us on the fridge for 10 years. 70 B.C. Mount Toba erupted, almost wiped out the human race. Around 70 years ago, humanity's global population dropped down to only a few thousand individuals, and it had major effects on our species. One theory claims that a massive supervolcano in Indonesia erupted, blackening the sky with ash, plunging Earth into an ice age, and killing off all but the hardiest humans. Well, we didn't need those weaker humans anyway. They came back. B.C. Mount Toba, not likely. The main thrust of the theory is based on global cooking and an ice age lasting a 1,000 years because of a projected 3°C to 5°C drop in temperature. We've had ice ages. They come with 12 to 15°C drops in temperature caused by the Milankovitch cycles, orbital dynamics. Glaciation periods have little effect on Africa or the southern hemisphere. In the northern hemisphere they're more severe. But in the US the furthest south they got was southern Kentucky. They didn't make it as far south in Europe. Glaciar maximum last ice age. Consequently, there is no evidence that it released enough material to cause a significant drop in global temperatures to trigger an ice age. And there is a huge amount of evidence contradicting the ice age theory or that humans were almost wiped out. Further geological evidence tells us that the previous ice age was about 130,000 years before the most recent, as pictured in the above map. The CO2 isotope studies confirm that. If you get into paleontology, you'll find the human species was believed to be both very diverse, with each diverse group being pretty darn small for over a million years. I have read as small as 25,000 individuals based on mitochondrial studies. Then there is the geological record of the megadroughts that began in Africa 130,000 years ago and lasted, on and off, for 50,000 years. Droughts that decimated the flora and fauna in Africa were a young species, less than 375,000 years in the fossil records. Plus, early on, we really weren't that successful as we didn't become full toolising, communicating, behaviorally modern Homo sapiens until about 50,000 years ago. Though even that is contention. The problem is that the eruption is coincidental with the bottleneck theory that spans from 100,000 BC to 50,000 BC in the human nature to find the single cause explanation. So the volcano would not have helped, but there were other geological events, like the megadroughts that lasted for 50,000 years, that overlap. Then we have to add in our evolutionary past, speciation, warfare, disease, and other environmental factors before we engage in our very human wishful thinking for simple answers when they're almost always complex. When you talk about the human species being very diverse, but each group is very small, do you mean groups like the Neanderthaler, or do you mean different flavors of Homo sapiens like, say, a husky versus a Pomerian? Jessica Biel not naming her son Batmobile. Finally someone says it. It's on Jessica by Unbelievable. Randy, you son of a. If we're talking about loss of human life, probably the reign of Genghis Khan. Some estimates place his KD ratio as high as 60,000:1. At the time of his reign, this was 10% of the human population of Earth. TBF, he made up for it by having so many kids that a few percent of the entire human population are his offspring. Edit, S, which I thought was implied. That's a common meme. But the truth is that the genetic marker used to prove that was actually a marker common in Mongol men from the time frame. It's an indicator of how much the Mongolian army fucked, not Genghis Khan himself. You spelled raped wrong. He literally killed enough people to cool the earth. I'm something of an environmentalist myself. Genghis Khan. Skylar sings happy birthday to Ted scene. Holy shit, I had forgotten about that. Love the comment that says this scene right here caused Breaking Bad to have a 9.5 rating on IMDb instead of a 10. Literally 5 minutes ago I was searching the ratings of season 2 on IMDb to see if that episode was rated lower than the others because of that scene. Makes total sense. Oh god, why did you have to remind me, lol. The Rape of Nanking isn't great. There's so many bad events. But that one stands out, besides the Holocaust, which has been mentioned here of course. Worst part is the Memorial Museum. Not sure if it's still the same. But the end of the tour makes you walk through a literal burial pit of bodies. They're under glass, but it is extremely upsetting, as it should be, I guess, haunts me to this day. This trip was 20 years ago. I went 5 years ago and can say that part with the burial pit was still there then. It was very somber. What does somber mean? English isn't my first language. I seriously get so irked when people try to castigate the US for dropping the bombs and completely ignore the who's who of atrocity commission that went on between 1914 and 1950. I get it, US bad. But so was everyone else at the time. There was absolutely no moral high ground for anyone to stand on in World War II. It was pure hell, and several of the countries on both sides were full-blown engaged in some really heinous shit before 1939. I think many people don't know how bad the Pacific Theater became. It was a horrific campaign. Japan was not going to surrender. Before the successful atomic bomb tests, the operational plan was a land-based invasion of Japan, preceded by a full naval blockade and firebombings of cities to sufficiently impact the decentralized Japanese war industries. That would have killed millions. Starvation and disease from the food and medicine shortages as a result of the blockade. The Meeting House Tokyo firebombings alone killed as many people as either atomic bomb. Japan was preparing to arm civilians with spears and makeshift weapons to resist. And there are innumerable examples throughout the island campaigns of civilians fighting to the death or committing suicide en masse rather than surrender to the US troops. Multiply that out by the size of the Japanese home islands and it would be an unimaginably bloody invasion. Of course the Allies could just have ceased aggression, but at the time of the surrender, Japan was still waging a brutal military campaign in China that had claimed 1,520 million lives on the Chinese side alone since 1937. They would not have stopped. Dan Carlin has a fantastic 25-plus-hour podcast series on the subject and describes World War II at that point as a human lawnmower and out-of-control situation where human beings were being endlessly mown down in their millions. The atomic bombs managed to throw a big enough spanner into that lawnmower's works to actually stop it. Were the atomic bombs atrocities? Yes, absolutely. Did their use prevent further and worse atrocities? Also yes. If they hadn't been used but had still been developed, people would look back and criticize not using them to bring an end to the war as morally unjustifiable. That basketball scene from Catwoman. One of the comments said Edward Scissorhands edited this scene over 100 cuts in under 2 minutes. Of all the things I looked up and read about in this thread, this is the one I would like to take back. It was so much worse than I could have expected. My dad said that exact same thing about my birth. Probably when that fish sprouted legs. Thanks to that asshole I have to get up tomorrow and go to work. Fuck that guy. Don't forget about taxes. Fuck that fish man. The Rwandan genocide of 1994. Almost 1,000 Tutsi people were killed by Hutu people in only about 3 months. That's almost 10,000 people a day in a small country. Let that sink in. Don't forget the 200,000 plus rapes that occurred during the genocide, sometimes carried out by rape squads made up of HIV-positive men. The Hutu were so unhinged they even killed other Hutus simply because they didn't want to take part in the massacre, and God help you if you were caught aiding a Tutsi. It was the worst and most extreme case of you're either with us or against us. Depraved doesn't do it justice. The Rwandan genocide will always stick with me. In high school, I had a Spanish teacher from Rwanda, a very distinguished and intelligent man who could speak 5+ languages fluently. He fled to the US from Rwanda during the genocide. He took a week from his normal teachings each year to talk to his students about the genocide, and the stories he told were heartbreaking, terrifying, and eye-opening. You could tell he would start to get emotional during some of the stories. He even had a scar on the top of his head from where a bullet grazed him as he was fleeing his city. Those stories were only from one man's personal experience during that time. I can only imagine the stories that the millions of other residents of Rwanda at the time could tell as well. An extremely terrible time in history. Without a doubt. You went to school with Paul Kagame? The fact only 1.6% of human history is recorded. That's 295,000 years of modern human history missing. And even then so little of the last 5,000 years is even recorded. Don't worry, we're making up for it now. Future scientists will be able to document human evolution based on video evidence of the human butthole. Provided the internet remains a thing. 2012. Showed my niece the movie and she couldn't believe we all survived that. We could have had a movie where the moon falls on Earth that could have not been more ridiculous and absurd. Wait. It was absolutely ridiculous. Did I still enjoy it? Yes. Yes I did. Wait till she hears about Y2K. That time I decided not to go to church, according to my mom. When you die and go to hell then you can answer to Satan. Okay. It has yet to come. What are you planning, dude? Aggressive baby shower. Followed by a super aggressive gender reveal. The sacking of Baghdad by the Mongols. I don't think people realize how bad this was. Baghdad was the mathematical and scientific center of the world at the time and it still hasn't recovered to this day. It set the entire region back centuries. Of course the fall of the Roman Empire might be as bad. It's wild to me that you could live 50 years after everything around you was built and not be able to understand or recreate any of it. The Roman Empire didn't really fall though. It slowly decayed. But it stuck around for hundreds more years in various forms as the Eastern and Western Empire. There was literary and historical continuity throughout. Even the sack of Rome didn't really represent a seismic shift in the political structure. It was unsettling but not many people died and things mostly carried on as normal. I stubbed my toe real bad one time. Dude, let me tell you, I was comforting my daughter in the middle of the night. I stubbed my toe on her bedpost, stepped on Legos and while stumbling back I hit my funny bone on the door, all while not being able to tell out of pain because that little girl was finally back to sleep. The challenges the human male must face when taking care of his offspring. To me the Holocaust stands out. First of all because of the sheer number of victims for the sole reason of belonging to a certain community and secondly for the methodical, industrial approach of the operation. I wish people would understand this. The Holocaust isn't considered the most evil things humans have ever done purely because of the number of deaths. It's because of the way it was industrialized and turned mass murder into a factory industry. It's because of the amount of effort that went into planning and bureaucratizing it. They scientifically calculated how to kill the most people at once, and industry abetted them in building the machines to do it. These were death factories with production quotas and team-building exercises, and their product was human ashes. No other genocide has monetized the goddamn victims' actual bodies in the same way. The fact that will never stop haunting me is that Auschwitz had specific teams of workers assigned to do nothing but burn family photo albums and children's toys, because they were considered worthless and the camp received so many of them, 24 hours a day. Also, Germany in the 1800s was one of the birthplaces of liberal thought. That is that people's rights should be respected. Them going from that to the Nazi atrocities show that the backslide to despotism is possible from any society, including ours. Exactly. It was the most educated and developed country on earth prior to the First World War, and throughout the 18th and 19th centuries was regarded as pretty much the center of Western civilization and scientific thought, not to mention the extreme progressivism of the Weimar Republic just a decade before. Pre-human history, but gonna go with the end Permian mass extinction, also known as the Great Dying, which led to the extinction of between 9,000 and 96% of every living organism on the planet. There were tons of animals with radically different body plans that went extinct, all kinds of radial symmetries, think starfish, and weirder things. Most large animals today are descended from very few surviving body plans, especially the four-finned fish with forward-facing eyes that became most mammals. I'm gonna go a bit further back in time. The massacre of the Gauls, about 20 million dead, only 200,000 were soldiers. Or the sacking of Rome Part 1, 2 and 3. Part 3 comes with Visigoths. Imagine the population we could have had because it happened way back when. Or imagine the unity of Rome, who had technology we couldn't make even till today. They were about to make steam power, for goodness sake. Edit, I apologize if the numbers are incorrect, but I told another person that the numbers were speculative but still high in the millions. Where did you get 23 million? It wasn't just the Gauls. So the Romans deemed anyone as a combatant and went about as a scourge across Europe. The Germanics died. The Britons, the Goths, the Ostrogoths, Visigoths, Gauls and other groups. It was just terrible with no defined numbers. Nobody took records back then. Some say 10, some say 30, so I'm just going for the medium. It was the Gallic War, but it's been grouped in as explicitly the Gauls, which isn't entirely true, as you've just seen. So the Vandals escaped, and that's why we have graffiti and keyed cars today. Destruction of the Library of Alexandria. The library was a great institute of learning in its heyday, but by the time of its destruction it had been in decline for some time. Also, the texts contained within weren't unique, and almost all likely had multiple copies in other institutions. In general, it's not great when a library is destroyed, but this one's significance has been overblown. There's some speculation it was even abandoned and decrepit at the time it burnt, and had been for years. There's not a lot mentioning the library around the time it was burnt, because nobody cared. Lol. Massively overblown. It was probably very important in its time, but everything I've read says it was not nearly as large of a loss as people on Reddit like to dream. The loss was the architecture itself, the building, not any of its contents. Objectively, it was the Black Death. Only period in recorded history where you can see the human population decrease for several years. Eurasian diseases killed something like 95% of the indigenous peoples of the Americas by the 1600s, barely a century after Columbus. That is much, much bigger than the Black Death. Entire cultures and nations were completely and utterly wiped out. Modern-day US and Canada were left so empty Europeans were able to take over in a way they couldn't with Africa and Asia, because there were people there. And the trade routes in North and South America were so extensive. Diseases would spread ahead of Europeans. Whole villages would be decimated without anyone ever seeing a white person. Gal Gadot singing Imagine. That new Fall Out Boy version of We Didn't Start the Fire really missed an opportunity to end a line with Gal Gadot in quarantine. Knock off Home Depot submarine. The First World War. Curious, why the first over the second? The second was far worse in terms of aims and deaths. World War I had about 19 million dead. World War II had almost 90 million. The second could not have happened without the first, due to the Treaty of Versailles and the interwar period, notably the Roaring Twenties and the Great Depression, which were partly due to the end of World War I. Even events today are as a result of the Great War to some extent, us British carving up Mesopotamia for example, and making an absolute mess of the Middle East as a result. Those events have been felt over the last few decades. The Cold War too came as a result of World War II, which like you say was a knock-on effect of World War I. That created the Iron Curtain and led to so many revolutions by countries we know to this day. In some ways is the cause of the Russo-Ukraine war happening at present. given that there are territorial arguments over what is Ukraine and what isn't, Crimea for example.